Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Stimson Center. My name is Andrew Hyde, and I'm a senior fellow and director here. And today's discussion, I'm confident, will be compelling and interesting, taking a close look at how the rules, patterns, and practice of member state financing at the United Nations and other multilateral organizations can openly and sometimes surreptitiously influence what they do and how they are managed. Our discussion today is under the umbrella of Stimson's project on U.S. financial leadership in multilateral organizations. This is a project that's near and dear to my heart, as it was the first one I started when I came here several years ago. And it builds on work that I did as U.S. diplomat in the State Department's Bureau of International Organization Affairs. Over the course of the project, we have looked at the diplomatic and practical implications of growing U.S. arrears at the UN, mostly to peacekeeping, now totaling over $1 billion, and how the UN and other member states have adapted to that reality. The project has also looked at how China has exploited to its own benefit that U.S. funding gap, even as its share of U.S. funding obligations has skyrocketed along with the size and heft of its economy. More recently, we have looked at how certain thematic areas are funded, including health and arms control. And coming out shortly, next week, in fact, we're going to be having a paper looking at UN environmental programs and how they're funded and what the funding patterns, the implications for the UN's work in the environment have been. We will also be embarking on research in the coming months that will focus on how the UN specialized agencies that align with key industries, global industries, such as aviation, telecommunications, and shipping, to better understand how their funding mechanisms matter to U.S. and international business. But more importantly, we are here today to discuss the launch of a new book, a new and exciting book, I think, called Transforming International Institutions, How Money Quietly Sidelined Multilateralism at the UN, by Dr. Erin Graham. In my view, this book brings some much needed, at least in Washington, historical and policy context to this ongoing debate and uncertainty surrounding how multilateral organizations are funded, and more specifically, how that relates to U.S. national interests. Joining us is former Ambassador Mark P. Lagon, a friend to Stimson, and this project in particular. He, in fact, authored one of the papers one of our early papers for the project, looking at the challenges and contradictions in funding multilateral health diplomacy. In fact, it's thanks to Mark, who flagged for me a couple of months ago this book, that we are here today. So he and I have had a chance to talk about it and work over the years on this larger topic. Now, my expectation today is that our discussion will focus on how the rules, patterns, and practices of funding the United Nations can and do have an outsized effect on the organization's priorities, achievements, and perceived legitimacy, along with its organizational evolution. In the book, Dr. Graham argues that a steady flow of small and incremental 20th century changes in UN funding rules have sidelined genuine multilateral governance in the 21st century and led to a rather lopsided and distinctly unrepresentative situation today. We'll also look at the implications of funding arrangements, dues, replenishments, and voluntary funding, and how the U.S. has approached its funding responsibilities in multilateral institutions. So you can see that what we're really sort of looking at this from a governance and political standpoint, not sort of a hard financial or money standpoint, but the two are intricately related. So I'll first ask Erin to provide us with some key takeaways from her work, particularly her perspectives on current funding challenges both for the UN and for the U.S. Next, I'll turn to Mark for his reactions, thoughts, and experience. We will then have a brief panel discussion before turning to the in-person and online audience for your comments and questions. So please be ready. And in fact, online, we're welcome to take questions as soon as you have them. So we'll have a list of questions up here and be happy to address those as well as any in-person questions. So a bit of brief background on our speakers before we get underway. Dr. Erin Graham is an associate professor of global affairs at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining Notre Dame, she was an associate professor of politics at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Other prior appointments include Global Order Visiting Scholar at Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania and postdoctoral fellow at the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton University. Dr. Graham completed her PhD in the Department of Political Science at Ohio State University And her research focuses on the design, financing, and development of international rules and organizations. And she has an impressively long list of publications on this topic, but in some ways my feeling is, looking at your background, this book has really brought a lot of that together for you. Mark P. Ligon is currently Chief Policy Officer at Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, as well as a Distinguished Senior Fellow in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. From 2007 to 2009, Mark served as Ambassador at Large, directing the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons at the U.S. Department of State. Before that, from 2004 to 2007, he served in my old bureau as well, the Bureau of International Organization Affairs at the State Department, as Deputy Assistant Secretary in that bureau. In this capacity, he had lead responsibility for United Nations-related human rights and humanitarian issues, UN reform, and outreach. And then, prior to that, Mark and I have some common overlap of things in this area that we worked on, and that will come up, I think, in our discussion. But for now, let's get on to the discussion. So I will turn it over to you, Erin, for your opening comments.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for inviting me to be here at Stimson, and to Ambassador Ligon for joining us and for bringing the book to his attention. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited about the discussion that follows my remarks. I want to do three things in 15 minutes or less. The first is I want to give you a sense of the circumstances at the UN that motivated my interest in this topic and writing the book in particular, which does bring together a lot of my previous work and adds an argument, I think. And then I want to talk a little bit about what that argument is and a bit on the historical content of the book, much of which is historical. And then I'll talk, maybe most importantly for this audience, about the contemporary context and some of the challenges that are posed by the way the current system operates. So first, circumstances that motivated the book. If we look at the UN development system in the last 15 to 20 years, between 70 and 80% of the money that flows through that system is earmarked by the donor. So they're voluntary contributions that are earmarked by donors. So when I say UN development system, I'm referencing both the UN programs and funds, like the UN Development Program. I'm also referencing the specialized agencies of the UN, like the World Health Organization or the Food and Agriculture Organization. And when I say earmarked by the donor, I mean that the donor places some condition, often quite a tight condition, on how that money is allocated. So you might have a loose earmark that says, I need this used for climate adaptation, or I need this used for vaccines. But within the UN system in particular, earmarks are often tight, which means they're at the country or project-specific level. And what that means, of course, is that the multilateral governing bodies that I think we so often associate with the United Nations and their one country, one vote rules aren't actually controlling the vast majority of the funding that flows through the system. And when I first sort of arrived at this conclusion or realized this empirical reality, which was now 10 or so years ago, I think my first publication on this topic came in 2015, I was really struck by the fact that our conceptions of the UN hadn't updated to reflect this reality. If we think about advocates of the United Nations, a lot of the positive things they associate with the UN, like its representation and the legitimacy that flows from it, stem from egalitarian multilateralism and one country, one vote. If we think about critics of the United Nations, often in the United States, for sure, a lot of the problems they associate with the UN system, the inability to translate power into influence, are also stem from that egalitarian multilateralism. And yet, the UN development system, it wasn't really functioning that way at all. Like most of the money, that's not how it's being allocated. So I was really struck by this mismatch. So my motivation for writing the book was to think about, how did the UN development system arrive at this condition? How did this transformation occur? Because if we look back at the initial design of the United Nations, there's just one rule in the UN Charter that pertains to financing. It's very brief, and it outlines a mandatory funding system. So how did we get from there, an institutional design with a mandatory funding system, to where we are today, to here, this contemporary system that's relying on voluntary contributions, most of which are being earmarked by donors? So I'm a political scientist. There's a theory chapter in this book that engages a lot of literature on how international law and organizations change and political development literature. But I think descriptively I could boil the argument down to something like this. The transformation happens slowly at first, quietly, under the radar, Most observers didn't see the transformation coming until the transition to earmarking was so far along that it had really become entrenched in donor practices. So those that set in motion what I refer to in the book as a slow-moving subterranean process, so altering, for example, funding rules in the 1960s, they didn't really have in mind that they were going to transform UN multilateralism in, say, the late 90s or early 2000s, but some of their actions did make possible the contemporary situation. And I think one of the interesting things, because we tend to associate this behavior with maybe powerful states that want more influence at the UN, is that a lot of the states that initially earmarked their contributions were states we think of as being quite friendly to the UN system. So states like Sweden or the Netherlands were among the early earmark states. They thought of these as a supplement to their regular resource contributions to the UN. But as UN politics changed over time and the practice became more widespread, it became a substitute for regular and core resources. Okay. So the book tells the historical trajectory of UN funding. It starts with those debates over the UN Charter, and I think makes some interesting arguments, actually, but I'm not going to talk about that today. The early technical assistance programs at the UN that are really the forerunners for the development system were initially included under the regular budget, under that mandatory assessment system, but it was really controversial even initially, because the Soviet Union was really opposed to including things like this under the mandatory system. European states weren't that excited to pay dues to the UN at the time. And so they created a parallel set of voluntary funding rules. It wasn't really to undermine the UN, it was to supplement and allow the UN to expand its work in ways that it wouldn't be able to under the mandatory system. But there was no functional difference in terms of what was being funded in the regular budget, those technical assistance programs, and what was being funded outside those technical assistance programs. The book spends quite a bit of time on the critical decade of the 1960s, because this is when voluntary rules that permit earmarks come in to the UN system. And I tell a story about how the UN Development Program received this contribution from the Netherlands. It was earmarked for something called Special Industrialized Services. And the UN administrator, who was new, UNDP had just been created, knew that it was illegal to accept this. So they consulted the UN Office of Legal Affairs. And the UN Office of Legal Affairs said, yeah, it's illegal, but let us get back to you, and we'll figure out a way that we can accept this. And so they made use of a rule that the UN Secretary General had that allowed him to accept contributions from, say, the Rockefeller Foundation to build a UN library or something like this. And then you can use it for the purposes, and it'll all be legal. And later, this rule which was thought of as an exception, was really unceremoniously and without much discussion incorporated UND rules at the time. Now, what happened, in 1967, we don't see a huge rise in earmarked funding throughout the UN system, but what we do see is sort of a smattering of these trust funds throughout the UN. They're mostly from European states. Canada had a few as well. We don't see the big economies very involved, so the United States was not part of this trend. And these trust funds basically look like they're for bilateral aid. So a lot of them go to regional interests or former colonial states. We see Norway funding the training of petroleum workers in Angola through UNDP, for instance, which becomes very important to the petroleum industry. And so we see kind of this smattering. The UN's not really keeping track of what's going on. And the trend looked minor at the time. And a big part of why the trend looks minor is, again, the United States wasn't involved. And so it's important to sort of think back and remember that not only was the U.S. paying a higher proportion of the regular budget dues at the UN, but at this time the U.S. was paying often 50% of the voluntary contributions to UN programs. And the U.S. was not earmarking any of these contributions. So these small economies earmarking a few trust funds here and there, it didn't look like something that would have a big influence on the UN's trajectory. Now, this changes rather rapidly in the 1980s. So the politics at the UN were such that the US had become frustrated at the UN for some time for a number of reasons. One of those reasons was the rising budget costs, the regular budget in particular. What changed with the Reagan administration is that rather than just sort of complaining about it or trying ineffectively to do something about it, they moved quite effectively to change policy. And so one thing the U.S. does is it leads the wealthy states, it's called the Geneva Group of Donors that contribute quite a bit to the United Nations, to hold down budgets to zero growth across the UN system. So the UN specialized agencies and the UN proper, basically those regular budgets stop growing. The US also starts to cut its voluntary core contributions in some instances pretty significantly. And so if we're interested in this transition, we're interested in like an absolute increase in earmarked funding, but we're also interested in what's going on with the other stuff, right? The mandatory contributions and the core contributions. And so in the 80s, we see the unearmarked parts of the budgets all held down, and we see the transition to earmark really accelerate. And from the late 1980s onward up until, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, when this starts to gain some traction as a problem in the UN system, we just see that trajectory continue, and it really shifts us toward the contemporary period when we have up to 80% of the money being earmarked. So I've managed to speak without my notes, so I have to catch up here. So if we arrive at the contemporary period today, what are the challenges? And the one thing I would say at the outset is it's not without its advantages, because I think from the United Nations perspective, if you read this period in the 1980s, for instance, you might think that the UN is going to go out of business. I mean, it really looks like a time when it doesn't have a lot of support from the countries that fund it. And instead what we see is this really remarkable growth in the activities of the UN system. And all of this happens through earmarked resources. And so I think the UN system would be much smaller today and would do a lot less work if this trend hadn't occurred. That said, most, both OECD countries and UN agencies themselves recognize now that this situation is not ideal. It's not an efficient system. So there was a study from the German Development Institute recently that looked at Germany's contracts with the UN between 2015 and 2017. It found that Germany had more than 500 separate contracts to govern their funds to UN entities. So that gives you a sense of the efficiency issues to mobilize resources with Germany for those different contracts, to manage those different contracts. And Germany's not an outlier, I don't think, right? This is how wealthy states and the donors to the UN system operate. They have multiple contracts with different UN agencies that govern those interactions. It's not a system in which funding allocations tend to match agreed upon priorities. So across the United Nations system, whether we're looking at UNICEF or the World Health Organization or the World Food Program, they all talk about these imbalances. They say, some issues are overfunded. We get more money than we need because they're really popular. And some issues don't get any money because they're not popular. So I think if we want a system that responds to need rather than the development world's sort of equivalent of the flavor of the week, if we want international organizations that can fund clearly defined mandates instead of giving these organizations incentives to go outside their mandate where the money is, and if we want international organizations that are more agile and can respond to emergencies, then current levels of earmarking are problematic across the system. So in the concluding chapter, my book talks a fair bit about some of the initiatives. Nearly all UN agencies have made some attempts to address this. Most of them have done so, I think, completely ineffectively. The UN Funding Compact a few years ago got quite a bit of attention, and it sort of remains to be seen the extent to which that might have an effect throughout the UN system. In my mind, it really remains to be seen whether donors, although they clearly recognize the problems with the system, are ready to roll back and change their behavior in a significant way. So I'll leave it there and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent overview, and I think you captured a lot of things in the book and in the overview that I think are on people's minds right now. Just before I turn to Mark, I'll just say I keep thinking of the word earmark, and it has a different meaning in this town in some ways.
Course,
and it's
yeah.
interesting that Congress has now gone back to earmarking in some ways with certain rules and regulations. And I'm kind of in the back of my mind, we can talk about this a little bit later, but wondering if there's some lessons from the congressional sort of oscillation on earmarks that could apply in the international sphere. But let me turn it over to Mark, who has extensive experience in this area, and will give us some comments.
This is a wonderful book, and I look at it from multiple perspectives. One is on faculty at Georgetown University, and it shines a light on really important issues of why following the money is really important in understanding the politics, the norms of multilateral institutions. I look at this as a practitioner at state and the think tank world on multilateral institutions in the UN in particular, and then through the lens of my most recent work in global health and institutions related to that. The book orbits around, although it doesn't necessarily make its central focus, a conundrum that voluntary funding or conditional funding force multilateral institutions to prove their worth. That if you have to raise money from member states, there has to be delivering. The question is who's being delivered for? Is it the donors' wishes? Is it the need of low and middle income country governments? The needs of people in those countries? But there is a serious problem in the way institutions become beholden to the donors for voluntary or conditional funding. And it's much like the NGO world in the United States. If you don't have core support, you end up looking for project work that you may or may not have the full capacity to do, and you sort of have this eating your own seed money to staff something. And then also even the very best institutions, agencies in the UN, most effective, World Food Program, UNHCR is the refugee agency, they're constantly fundraising. I mean, it is really quite striking that, you'd see ads for UNHCR on television. But there's a subtlety to this book that is really helpful by forcing people to look back at these phases. The ethic of multilateralism early on, this egalitarian multilateralist norm, and how that norm changes. And I think it's important to think about how things evolve slowly and there being particular turning points. There is this emphasis, as Professor Graham notes, on the 1960s. You may not know this, but when I was studying for my PhD, a member of the faculty of Georgetown University was the returning UN ambassador, Jean Kirkpatrick. And I was her teaching assistant, and I went to work for her in the think tank world. And I did not agree with everything, particularly on the view of friendly dictatorships that Ambassador Kirkpatrick had. But I got an earful about the ethic that was behind the idea of making the UN accountable. And it was accompanied with the toughest of tough love, like getting out of UNESCO. One of the times the United States has gotten out of UNESCO, being unhappy. That's the ultimate opposite form of voluntary conditional funding, which is to pull your funding. So this book is in large part about earmarking and conditionality actually being a contradiction of the norm of multilateralism. And I think it's a good question about what multilateralism is and who defines it. I'm a constructivist, so I think there are people who are elite specialists who frame issues and determine what multilateralism is, and it changes. My view on this is heavily influenced from having been a Senate Foreign Relations Committee staffer when Senators Helms and Biden came together on an initiative neither of them would have proposed in its final form. Senator Helms would not really have wanted to repay $1.3 billion of back dues, and Senator Biden would not have wanted to subject the UN to conditions for the U.S. paying up on its treaty obligation. But the United States engaged in really tough love of, and the two major or three major conditions that were called reforms were lowering the dues rate, the assessment rate for the United States, in the form of saying that the top donor should be capped, but it had an effect on the whole system. You talk about creativity. It's a sign of just how creative the UN system had been, is when the conditions had almost been met for changing the assessment scale to satisfy the precepts in the legislation and allow the back dues to be paid. And so the gap was paid by Ted Turner and the UN Foundation. And it is actually quite remarkable that something to pay core things came from an outside source. And it is to the credit of the late Senator Helms, for whatever one thinks of him, that he took yes for an answer as opposed to saying, well, you only got 95%, so sorry. So I don't think that kind of formula of the ultimate tough love can work anymore. And many have tried to honor or copy the Helms-Biden tradition. Chairman Henry Hyde, Chairperson Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Nikki Haley, to some extent, in her ambassadorship, have tried to have the threat of pulling your money and a move towards saying that voluntary funding drives UN institutions to be more responsive. I don't think that formula can work anymore. It worked in part with lots of bruises in the Helms-Biden case. But even more hard to imagine is putting the genie in the bottle of having unconditional and full payment of dues without conditionality. Evolving your way backward, will require a step-by-step approach. And just a note to step back on various funding schemes, which Professor Graham alludes to. There are different funding schemes, and with them are associated different kinds of voice given to the donor, whether they be assessment rates, dues, voluntary funding, or in some institutions like World Bank IDA or the Global Fund, for which I'm a professional advocate, have replenishments, that every few years governments make pledges, and they're multi-year commitments, and they sort of drive each other up, and there are varying degrees of conditionality. The UN is ostensibly one nation, one vote, whether in the UN itself or its major agencies like the ILO and the WHO, but voluntary funding adds a special voice on top of that to change the reality. There are other multilateral institutions, particularly the multilateral development banks, and it's important to say that they have the unique feature that your voting weight is according to how much money you put in. So an analog of core support is that you get voting weighted to the amount that you're putting in. And there were reforms on how much different players paid and how much voice there were when Bob Zellick was head of the World Bank. But then there are the health institutions, and Andrew has related the origins of a 2021 Stimson paper that I wrote on health institutions. But it's worth thinking about institutions that were, not just the disruptive or distorting effect in the UN that you describe, but the creation of institutions outside of the UN to complement, supplement it, and then the effect on the system itself. The Global Fund was created 21 years ago with the enthusiastic support of the UN's best Secretary General and its only lifer in the system, Kofi Annan, and it has replenishments every 3 years. It's focused on a narrow issue set, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, ostensibly does not have conditions. It's on a narrower set of issues, so countries step up and say they're interested in fighting these 3 most deadly infectious diseases. But the norm of committing to the replenishment without conditions is beginning to corrode. So the United States has always had the practice of saying that it was going to set aside 5% of its major contribution to this institution, which is about a third of the budget of the Global Fund, for its own U.S. Agency for International Development to do technical assistance to the grantees of the Global Fund. But now it's increasing. So France, in the latest replenishment, had a massive set-aside, which is essentially steering money back into its bilateral programs. And a super generous and far-sighted country, Japan, interested in solving the three diseases, but also broader health system strengthening and universal health coverage that it advances, it has asked for very specific conditions. And as the country in scale and in percentage having the most consequential increase, that's a new thing to be dealt with. And now the World Health Organization is trying to regularize people's donations, so it's not so reliant on voluntary funding, and tries to not say it's increasing the overall pool of funding demanded of donors, but ask that they think more strategically, holistically, and with fewer conditions. And most recently, and I'll stop with this, is the creation of a trust fund at the World Bank, the Pandemic Fund. And the first ideas about it, in order to steer funding, particularly to low and middle income countries, to prepare for the future inevitable pandemics to follow COVID-19, was to have the governance body be predominantly the donors. So you incentivize them to give more money because they'll have say. And it actually took a little time to suggest that the board, the governing board of this pandemic fund at the World Bank, needed to have the implementing countries of the Global South. And oh, by the way, civil society as well. And so there are 2 whole seats on the board of the Pandemic Fund for civil society, one of which is reserved for the civil society of the Global North. So I think it's worth stepping back and looking at not just conditionality, but these different types of funding, dues, voluntary replenishments, and then different forms that conditions or leverage take. Not to say your book should have included it, but I could see a future book by you or someone else that complements the really rich insight that you share.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's excellent. I'd like to just do a little terrain mapping here, I think, on a couple of these issues, because I found both in your book and your remarks sort of a fascinating confluence of looking at a couple of different things. One is, and you kind of alluded to it, Mark, as well, and I mentioned in our early research, so parts of the UN system are very much subject to voluntary contributions, and you talk in the book, and you said, UN development system. Other parts, for example, peacekeeping, there isn't a mechanism really for voluntary funding per se or earmarking. So I think it's important for us as we look across the entire sort of UN spending to remember where this is concentrated and the effects it has. And you mentioned, some of the more poor countries and their voices in that. And of course, that's very important in the development system. A different dynamic in the peacekeeping side, for example. So I do think it's important to see where that's concentrated. The other thing that you mentioned, Erin, in your remarks and in the book is talking about the small course corrections in the 60s and how that had an effect going forward. And one of the things that I've sort of in my own research spent time looking at is the voluntary funding and then the earmarked funding. And how much are those completely the same and how much are they separated? Mm-hmm. There is voluntary funding, and Mark, you alluded to this, there is voluntary funding that just goes to institutions saying, we're adding to this. And I think, part of the organizational theory that comes out in your book is institutions adapt to having more resources. So suddenly what was meant to be an addition becomes, well, a substitute, or just gets factored into this is how the organization is going to work. So donors still have influence, but it's organizational influence.
It's kind of interesting that some of the very countries who started the practice of creating trust funds give money to things like the World Food Program without strings. They try and feed it through a bundled or multilateral giving scheme so that it doesn't look like they have particular leverage.
And actually, that's a good point. So what I wanted to sort of just finish this, my thought on is to ask both of you, as you look at the motivations of countries, donors, who have decided to go ahead and we'll do a voluntary, we'll do an earmarked funding. Why are they running it through an international organization as opposed to just spending it themselves directly? Like, what does that add to it? Does it add capacity? Does it add legitimacy? Does it add I don't know, burden sharing and others coming along. I'm sort of curious about the motivations that the Netherlands you mentioned in the 60s when they started doing this. Like, well, why not just do it directly yourself? Why go through the 500 contracts that the Germans have or something? Why go through that efficiency problem and not do it directly?
I think on the historical point, it's sort of useful to remember that this was a period in which a lot of these states didn't have development infrastructure. And so, I mean, development was, as an industry, was just becoming something that a lot of Western states were doing. And so not everyone has the sort of bilateral aid infrastructure. If we bring it up to today, a lot of the states that earmark a lot are not. Well, I mean, everybody's doing it, and some of it's sort of path dependent, such that. So if you look at this analysis of Germany, you see a lot of the earmarked aid, it's coming from something like 8 different agencies within Germany, right? So it's complexity on the domestic side. And some of those agencies only provide earmark contributions. That's all they've done. And so for some larger donors, I think that's the case, and that's why they're running it through there. That's the way they've been doing it for a long time. I think for some others, maybe it's efficient for them to run their aid through a multilateral program because it's less costly for them if they had to implement it themselves. And the last thing I would say is for those same sort of smaller, medium-sized donors, if they earmark, they can get more credit, right? So one is there's the bilateral alternative, but if the other alternative is providing the core voluntary contributions that you're interested in, the size of their contribution isn't so significant such that they feel like they're getting any positive publicity benefit, whether with the recipient or with the international organization. Whereas if they earmark it, they can have their name on it. Sometimes in those contracts it says like you use our signage on the project, right?
Right.
And so I think there's some benefits.
Sort of a visibility piece.
Right, a visibility piece. Yeah.
Well, I think, but I do think one aspect too is the idea of leveraging. There was a study that the General Accounting Office did a few years ago on U.S. contributions to peacekeeping, and it really kind of got at the burden sharing piece, and it sort of argued, well, if the U.S. is spending $6-7 billion a year on peacekeeping, if the U.S. had to do this itself, which probably wouldn't happen directly, but in some cases, it would be 3 or 4 times more expensive. That by having the contributions of other countries and running it through the UN system, it was actually a cost-effective aspect for the U.S. to achieve its goals and national interests.
I mean, you both know better than I that the State Department often made this case at the
Yes,
Hill,
yes.
right? Trying to convince Congress that it was worthwhile to work through the UN and saying that we'll elicit more contributions from other economies.
Yeah.
Well, good question. And what are the motivations? I mean, sometimes you think a program is better under a multilateral or UN imprimatur. I mean, First Lady Laura Bush was an enthusiast of using re-entry of the United States into UNESCO to work on changing educational materials and norms for the view of women in Afghanistan during a situation of occupation, and better from the UN than from the US or a coalition. Sometimes middle-sized powers sort of like to call in an airstrike on their own country, and here's what I mean. Brazil, for instance, used to turn to the ILO to deal with a problem of forced labor in the interior of the country, in cattle ranching and agriculture, in a way that the national government could not, but that with the imprimatur of a major UN agency, you could do it. So paying money to another institution to have a multilateral program and norm. I'm glad you asked about burden sharing. I mean, I think the aforementioned Helms-Biden legislation or efforts by, then Ambassador Nikki Haley to have the assessment scale for peacekeeping reduce the U.S. Level are often premised upon the idea of burden sharing by other countries. It is funny on peacekeeping how much people think of burden sharing in dues rates from others as opposed to how much UN peacekeeping is a matter of burden sharing so that the U.S. military can concentrate on certain, particular strengths, whereas the peace operations can be largely done by others. I think it's interesting to see what do you need to get burden sharing. And first of all, it doesn't really work, as Ambassador Haley proposed, that you should reduce our assessment rate because we want to pay less. And we'll withhold the money if you don't change it. That is not a carrot and stick approach. That's a stick and stick approach, and it doesn't work, or it doesn't even work as well as the Helms-Biden formula. Again, the Global Fund has a good model for eliciting burden sharing. Congress, and we've talked about this before, conditionality from Congress on its funding to international organizations may have a disruptive effect at times. That one provision that guides how the U.S. gives money to the Global Fund is useful. It says the U.S. can't give more than a 33% share of the Global Fund's budget. That sounds enormously generous compared to the rates the United States wants to pay on the general budget or peacekeeping budget. But in effect, if the United States pledges significantly to the Global Fund, other nations know they have to come up with a 2-to-1 match to unlock the U.S. money. So forms of leadership that incentivize others and show the United States is going to do its part, that's a way to get at burden sharing that pulling money out or steering money from core to voluntary may not achieve.
I could keep going, but I'd like to just open it up to the audience here in person first, if anybody's got any questions or comments they'd like to raise, please. Then if we have a microphone, sorry. That was a quick transition too. If you maybe could identify yourself, please.
Hi there, my name's Alistair Somerville. I work for UNOPS, which perhaps has the most unusual of all of the funding mechanisms in the UN system. So very interesting conversation, and look forward to reading your book. My question isn't so much related to my work, but more the sort of historical part of your argument, and the why of countries moving towards earmarking and this issue of broader trust in the UN, its agencies, and its staff, I guess. To what extent did you see earmarking and the development of these kind of voluntary mechanisms as being a response to a need for institutional reform of UN agencies, but sort of not wanting to, or not being able to, do the sort of hard work of actually reforming the institution, and instead using funding as a way to sort of shape behavior without tackling kind of root institutional issues? Was that kind of the main driver, in addition to sort of domestic pressures as well, or were there specific incidents of kind of failures that governments were responding to in terms of UN implementation? I'd just be interested to hear in kind of sort of that trust issue in the UN and using funding as a way to kind of still contribute through the multilateral system, but maybe bypass some of the other reform issues that were too tricky to tackle.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the motivations from earmarking really differ depending on what decade, what era of the UN we're looking at. So my reading suggests, my research suggests that the early phase of earmarks, where we get rule changes that allow the practice, had more to do with member state politics than with any concerns about the UN's ability to deliver on its programs. So there were some issues in the 60s. You know, this is the Cold War. This is the kind of early days of new international economic order ideas. So, for instance, industrial development activities were very associated with the state driving driving the economy. And in the context of the Cold War, that was associated with the Soviet Union, and the United States was, that language was not language that the United States liked, and it was really negative connotation. And so when they established the UN Development Program, which came out of these prior funds, the Soviet Union started making all these suggestions about changes that needed to be implemented, and one of which was that industrial development should receive, a certain proportion of the funding for UNDP. And the United States basically said, we're not going to pay if these new rules are implemented, and of course we're the ones that pay for this. So those rules weren't incorporated, but a lot of the Western economies, so you can imagine some of the European states that don't have such a hard stance on this as the US, wanted to accommodate some of this, right? And so their earmarks for like special industrialized services and things like that were to sort of take a middle road on this approach. We can't get this. The United States doesn't like this, and the United States is too important to not like things. And so, given that's the case, maybe we can get around this so that the U.S. doesn't have to fund any of it. I think if we fast forward up to the 1980s and 90s, then the issues that you're talking about with dissatisfaction, with transparency in the UN system, with the ability of UN programs to implement, with corruption, all of these sorts of issues, when we think about UN reform, will those become really relevant? I think the limit on that explanation is that, as you just alluded to, there's quite a bit of variation across different UN programs. I mean, working in the UN system, I mean, some of them always had, something like UNICEF, always had a really good reputation in the United States. Mm-hmm. Even the UN Development Program, to a large extent, if you look through the 1980s and you look at congressional reports, the Reagan administration is saying, yeah, it performs poorly. It performs well. We just need to cut funding for budgetary reasons. So some of the UN organizations that were some of the most serious victims of this approach of increased earmarks really weren't necessarily the agencies that we had those trust issues with. But I think some of the trust issues with the UN system, it became associated with everyone at the UN. And so I think that undoubtedly had influence.
Mark?
It's a great question. I just make an aside that on earmarking, I alluded to the creation of the Global Fund to complement the work of the UN on AIDS, TB, and malaria. It is the talking point of the U.S. representative on the board of the Global Fund, no earmarking. And there's a little bit of an exception with the set aside for technical assistance. But in a commitment to a multilateral institution, if there is a focus and you don't want mission creep, then you suddenly become against earmarks. Whereas I think probably the United States and other quarters and in the UN has been a driver of this voluntary funding.
I'm sort of struck in the conversation and dialogue here that in some ways the inverse of earmarking is fund withholding. And both are to achieve certain policy goals from the standpoint, well, of the U.S. or individual countries, but the U.S., as you said, has the leverage and often does that. And so over the years, the U.S. has withheld funding to certain agencies to achieve whistleblower protection or gender disparities or other things, or it's earmarked funds for other goals. So it's kind of an interesting question. I mean, we've had experience, well, you mentioned UNESCO and pulling out our UNESCO twice, I think, over time. Mm-hmm. Human Rights Council, we pulled out. Again, perceptions about Israel bias, anti-Israel bias. And that was something that the U.S. was upset about and wanted to achieve a change by pulling out. And we can debate the merits of whether that actually accomplished the goals. But that's something the U.S. has done, and I think other countries to some extent, but probably the U.S. more than others. Let me turn to one question we have online from Ronnie Patz from Potsdam University, and it's to you, Erin. He asks, from your perspective, is there any way back to a truly multilateral UN system from where we stand today in terms of UN financing? Would your book suggest that the way back also requires another long-term subterranean change, or rather more of a big bang critical juncture?
Great question.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ronnie, who reviewed my book recently. Is there a way back? So I'm very skeptical of the efforts being made in the UN system to roll back the earmarking trend. Because although something like what the World Health Organization has done recently, which is to say, over time, I mean, they've set a date by which I think they want half of the contributions to be core contributions to the World Health Organization. And so this is starting to get attention, but a lot of these agencies have been asking states to earmark less of their contribution since 2000. And we haven't seen a significant shift across the UN agencies. So there has to be some way to incentivize it, I think. And I'm not sure many of the UN agencies have that leverage. Now, these replenishment ideas are interesting. The World Bank has a lot of trust funds, so there is earmarking at the bank, but it's about 40% rather than 80% of their contributions. And of course, the difference with the replenishment sort of process is that you have to pay a certain amount usually. I don't know how the Global Fund works, but for instance, the climate finance mechanisms, to participate in those meetings, you have to provide a certain amount of money. And so those replenishment meetings are donor meetings. And then you exert a lot of influence over the program of work. And if you're happy with that influence that you exert over the program of work, then, as you said, you don't want any earmarks. So if you speak to the U.S. Treasury, for instance, about the Global Environment Facility, they say, no, we don't want earmarks. We have a lot of influence over what the program is, and so we don't want anyone diverting resources from that program. So I guess one possibility would be for some more UN institutions, and they seem to be interested in moving more toward these replenishment, something like a replenishment model. Of course, in the UN, that poses all sorts of concerns among states that aren't going to be significant donors. But there does seem to be a bit of a trend among agencies to look at new funding modalities. Of course, for me, because my book is very skeptical of the ability to intentionally reform things, I could just say, who knows how it would happen? You'll have to look at it in retrospect and then trace it out. So perhaps not a satisfying answer, but those are some of my thoughts.
So I guess, but I think Helms-Biden would be seen as a big bang critical juncture aspect in some ways, where you sort of forced from the outside a reckoning of some sort. I mean, it didn't really change long-term behavior, but it you know, the U.S. got its cap on regular contributions, things people didn't think were possible. It required that sort of crisis almost.
I may be misinterpreting the question, but it sounds to me like a big bang. It's really more like, you know, a mini San Francisco conference where you're really rethinking the whole architecture and the rules of the game.
Well, I think of it as being exogenous, that something's coming in, either a conference or a significant country coming in and demanding change, but either way.
During the Bush era, some observers referred to competitive multilateralism, that, you know, to change how much the UN can successfully deliver on some of its goals by turning to other institutions or creating them. And some are very good and high value. I mean, you know, the Global Fund, you know, by a conservative estimate with its partners, has helped save 59 million lives over 21 years. But siloing that comes from creating an alternate institution through this competitive multilateralism model can create just even more chaos in a system where voluntary funding to the existing agencies is kind of skewing the work towards what the donor wants.
Okay, let me take one last question. I have an online question. I think it's a great one from Sarwar Minar at Florida International University. And he asks, have you come across any case in which funding, offerings, or projects proposed by any donor was denied by the UN?
No. That's a short answer.
That's a short answer.
Especially UNDP.
Yeah. So the UN does have this you know, the general financial rule is that you can't accept anything that contradicts the purposes of the United Nations. But of course, that's quite a broad set of conditions. I mean, I've spoken to people. I won't name any names. It was at UNDP. Someone who said basically, like, we don't turn down money, right? I mean, and this gets back to the previous question about what would it take. I think the UN would have to start saying no to earmarked contributions at some level. And I think that's very hard to do for organizational reasons. You know, all of these programs have their own organizational interests. And so you would have to put stronger conditions on the agency side of what we're willing to accept. And unless we see that, I don't expect much change. So I guess my answer is no. I haven't heard of any, certainly no high-profile cases that I know of the UN turning down project.
I guess in a sense, though, it's, in one way, it's not a black or white question. And I suspect, and I think I've seen from inside the State Department, that there's actually kind of a negotiation that can go on between a donor and a organization about, okay, what's this earmark going to do? How are we going to shape it? And the organization there isn't going to say no, but they might come back to the donor saying, well, for reasons you just mentioned, our goals, our charter said we need to go in this direction. Can you reshape the earmark in another way? And so I think there's probably a whole set of experiences out there of pre-negotiations before the earmark's actually put in place.
I think that's fair. I mean, on this point, another thing that I would say is that I think this book and a lot of other work on this issue emphasizes what this does for donors, right? The influence of donors. Another way to think about the competitive funding environment and the way these organizations are funded is that they don't have to, I'm sorry, a UN program or agency, they don't really have to appeal to the full membership when they think about resources, because that's not really where the money is. So if you had a strong organizational culture and you had a commitment to just a few issues, you have the ability to go out and mobilize on those issues and talk to the potential donors that you think will be most interested. So there are also opportunities, I think, for the agencies if they have their own brand and can be innovative in particular areas to market themselves in this environment. And so while yes, one model is just the donor coming to the UN agencies, it can also be the UN agencies coming to donors and convincing them that this is important work and that they can do it effectively.
I think there are a couple things worth complexifying. One is the sense that voluntary donors have undue sway and not so much core support funders. I mean, if you look at the World Health Organization, there's robust literature about private sector and some donors skewing its work by offering it additional money that it desperately needs to do its work. But there's, definitely from the United States perspective, a be careful what you wish for dynamic. That, China, it really needs to share the burden. For the longest time, its dues rates were low because of a way of calculating per capita GDP as the test. But now it's a substantial donor, and one of the reasons why it's influential in the WHO and controversial in certain circles in the origins of COVID-19 is through its increasing share of the core budget and voice that comes with that. Because it was my job as a Deputy Assistant Secretary to say, well, the United States is only one country and one nation, one vote on the UN's budget. But that's not true. I mean, you have a lot more weight. The other thing is just, you refer to donors properly, and so who are the other stakeholders? And it's an old-fashioned, perhaps a little colonial expression, beneficiaries. But are the beneficiaries of the other member states, or are they actually the people who are to be served and engaged? And that's why I mention the mere 2 seats on the Pandemic Fund board being for civil society and only one of them being for the Global South, is that if you were to account not just for the will of donors, voluntary or otherwise, but the countries in which much of the programmatic work will occur, you really need to think of the stakeholders as including communities and civil society and break out of the model. And the UN has shown itself capable of going beyond being an intergovernmental organization. I mean, the negotiation in 2015 of the Sustainable Development Goals had a real role for non-state actors in dialogue. So it can be done.
Well, I think with that, we will wrap up. The link to the book and where it can be purchased is on the Stimson website. So please go there, and for anyone in the audience, Erin is happy to sign if you have copies, and we'd be happy to take that. So thank you very much. And again, I neglected saying this earlier. I want to thank the Better World Campaign for its financial support for our research here at Stimson on this. This is an important juncture for us, I think, to be able to talk about these issues in greater depth. So we appreciate everyone coming, and very much thank you, Erin, for coming from Indiana, and Mark for coming from a few blocks away. But
happy to.
It's a great conversation. So thank you all very much.